All right. So welcome to the second session of our Restoration Torah Conference. Charlotte Erickson is going to be the next speaker. I'll have her come up in just a minute. One thing I wanted to turn a little time over, though, to Maria. So she's here in front. Go ahead, Maria. Maria is our treasurer, again, as I mentioned. Yeah, just there's fine.
Okay. We have a little donation box for anyone who would like to donate. You are not required to donate, but it would help to provide for
and if they have a check, they should make it out too.
Yeah, if you have a check.
Okay. Thank you, Maria. Okay, so Charlotte Erickson's going to talk about Joseph Smith's new translation of the Torah. So without any further ado, Charlotte. She's also a talented musician, so. Okay.
I just wanted to mention too that my daughter Zoe, I showed her the notes I could play on the shofar and asked her to make a nice little ditty, and that so she composed that, I guess, the little song I play. So. And for anyone on the Zoom call, you can use the chat feature to put in any questions in my talk or any of them. So don't be afraid to use that. Okay. Okay, we are going to talk about Joseph Smith's new translation. It's a fascination I've had for a long time, and let's see, here we go. So after the Book of Mormon was published and the church was formally organized, the next big assignment from the Lord to Joseph Smith was to make a new translation of the Bible. In fact, it was while the Book of Mormon was being printed at E.B. Grandin's print shop that Oliver Cowdery purchased a Bible from the Grandin bookstore to use. He bought it for $3.75. It was the 1828, so the cutting edge edition of the King James version of the Bible, which is actually a different one than the LDS scriptures use, which is an older one, about 60 years older. So right there are already some differences, but just tiny ones. Joseph Smith spent about 3 years on the project, which is also far more time than he spent on the Book of Mormon. When I was trying to think of a topic to tie together the restoration of the Torah, I couldn't think of a better one than this, because the fact that the Lord commanded the prophet of our dispensation to do a new translation of the Bible bears powerful testimony of the importance of the Bible. We weren't putting it behind us and moving on, we were adding to it. And so this assignment is strong evidence to me that studying and having a proper understanding of the Bible is relevant to Latter-day Saints, separate from any of the actual changes or new revelations that came along with it. The Lord directed Joseph Smith to make a new translation is mentioned several times in the Doctrine and Covenants, and also like letters and history of the church and things. Perhaps the earliest sign in Joseph's calling that the Bible was due for a new translation was when Joseph was visited by the angel Moroni, and Moroni quoted the Bible to him, but quoted it a little differently than what Joseph Smith had in his own Bible. So that was the first sign, and it might not seem that strange to us as Latter-day Saints, because we've got the Articles of Faith. The 8th Article of Faith says we believe the Bible to be the Word of God as far as it is translated correctly. So we have it as part of us that the Bible can be improved on, I guess, by Joseph Smith's translation. But at the time, that was not really an accepted opinion. It was really, and you'll find this a lot among Christians today too, that the King James Version of the Bible is without error, it's the absolute Word of God, and to even suggest there might be improvements that could be made is a pretty, you'll make some enemies if you talk about that. So anyway, another sign that the Bible wasn't perfect that Joseph would have noted is when he was translating the Book of Mormon. It talks in several places about the plain and precious things being taken away. So he might have had a premonition that there was something he could do there. Now, the process of translating the Book of Mormon was a catalyst for events related to the restoration. So it was a short time that he was translating the Book of Mormon, but he received 13 revelations that are in our Doctrine and Covenants during that time. And so here's the chronology of the contents in the Doctrine and Covenants. So you probably can't read any of that, but you can look it up in your own scriptures. It has the year that the revelations were received. So you can find for yourself which revelations were during the translation of the Book of Mormon, and it's numbers 6 through 18. So not only was the Book of Mormon coming along, but clearly God was speaking quite freely to Joseph Smith at that time too. Not only revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, but other items related to the restoration, such as when Joseph and Oliver went out to ask about baptism, and they were given the Aaronic priesthood, and they got baptized and stuff. That was all during the translation of the Book of Mormon. Well, similar to that, the process of making the new translation of the Bible seems to have been a catalyst for revelation related to the restoration as well. So if you look so he started translating it in June of 1830. Oh, I guess Brother Haglock let me borrow his laser here. So right here, 1830, here's July. So from right about here, all the way down this page is during the translation process of the Bible, all the way down to here. So if you actually count the sections, it's more than half of our Doctrine and Covenants was received during that 3-year period that the Bible was being translated. And I think that's amazing. And I think that this part of how meaningful this is not only all those sections, including the famous vision of the degrees of glory in section 76, which Brother Haglock talked about, which the Apostle Melvin Ballard called the climax of all wonderful revelations that have come from the Lord from the days of Father Adam until the present moment. That was one of them. And there's lots of other ones too. But a lesson we can take away from that is that maybe if we also search the Bible seeking revelation, we'll receive it as well for ourselves and have a strong spirit there. Okay, when Joseph Smith started the work of the new translation, he focused on Genesis, and about 20% of the verses that were changed were in Genesis. So today, all the examples I give are going to be from Genesis. There are lots of great ones from the whole Old Testament and the whole New Testament as well, but just for time and because of the theme of the conference, that's what I'm going to focus on. Actually, partway through Genesis, the Lord instructed him in another revelation, so this is section 45, to set aside the Old Testament for a time and begin work on the New Testament. So he switched to the New Testament, and then he finished that, and then he went back and picked up where he left off in Genesis and finished the Old Testament. So the way the process went is Joseph Smith had a scribe, and I'll talk about some of the scribes in a minute. And when the first part of the Old Testament and the first part of the New Testament, he would actually sit with the Bible and read every single verse and indicate the changes to the scribes. And even if the verse didn't have a change, the scribe would write the whole thing out. So the entire Bible is being written out in longhand. At some point in, I think it was the book of Matthew, so the first part of Genesis and then the first part of Matthew, they switched to a different system where they would take the Bible, mark in the Bible where the change was going to be, and then in the manuscript just write what was being changed. Word was deleted, word was added, phrase was added, punctuation, all those sorts of things. So that I'm sure was a lot faster. And so the actual marked Bible is an indispensable part of the new translation if you're one of the scholars that study it. So there was a couple different manuscripts of the Old Testament, a couple different ones in the New Testament, and then the Bible itself is necessary to understand all the markings. Okay, so Joseph Smith finished the new translation in 1833, and for the rest of his life, he continued to make improvements and preparations for the publication, but he never again talked about still working on the new translation itself. So people debate about whether he was done or not. he said he was done. So I'm going to go with that, even though he did keep preparing it. After he finished the new translation, he started studying German and Hebrew, maybe some other languages too, for his own purposes to better understand the Bible. And he also gave sermons that you can find in the Words of Joseph Smith or Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, where he would just make this statement like, this verse or this word would be better translated as such and such. And these are examples that weren't in the manuscripts of the new translation. So that's kind of interesting. It's like, maybe you'd just never be done because the Bible is so big. But I don't know if anyone's put all those together, but you can find them for yourself. Okay, so unfortunately the new translation was never published in Joseph's lifetime, although extracts were printed. After Joseph Smith was killed, his widow had the manuscripts and kept them when the saints came to Utah. She had the manuscripts and the marked Bible. And after the RLDS Church was organized, then her son, Joseph Smith's son, Joseph Smith III, set about to finally publish the translation, and he did it in the late 1860s. So the fact that the church that moved west didn't have the manuscripts, I think, is probably one reason the LDS Church hasn't ever put a huge emphasis on it. They didn't have the manuscripts to work with, but I'm happy to have learned that when Joseph Smith III did what his father had started, he did a good job at it, and I'll talk about that more in just a minute. Several people had the privilege of serving as scribe. So there were actually 7 people who served as scribes. So Frederick G. Williams, Sidney Rigdon, Oliver Cowdery, John Whitmer, and Emma Smith are 5. The 6th being Joseph Smith himself. He did do some of the writing himself. And the 7th, this is interesting to me, is as yet unidentified 7th scribe, whose writing is, according to the experts, generally consistent and is for the most part skillfully executed, easily readable, and even somewhat elegant. So I thought that was interesting. There's a book I'll talk about in a minute that analyzes all the handwriting. So that sort of thing is interesting. You can see how they can tell who was doing the writing because they didn't necessarily sign their name. Now there's revelations that tell us who was scribe and other historical documents, but they also can do like really detailed handwriting analysis. Now, none of the scribes who worked with Joseph Smith on that process came west with Brigham Young, and neither did the manuscripts or the marked Bible. So that might be another reason that the LDS Church didn't use any of Joseph Smith's changes in their Bible for over 100 years, even after the RLDS Church had published it. And they didn't have access. The RLDS Church and the LDS Church didn't really get along very well until a guy named Robert Matthews, let's see, I think pictures here, yeah. So he was instrumental in healing the relations between the LDS Church and the RLDS Church. And he finally got permission in the late 60s to study the manuscripts and the marked Bible directly. And his main goal in doing that was to see how good the inspired version, which was published by the RLDS Church, was compared to the original manuscripts. And he's definitely the authority on it. And so I'm going to quote him. He says, the printed editions of the inspired version are accurate and faithful to the original manuscripts in almost every particular. And he says in the 1867 version is pretty good, and then they keep improving it every time the RLDS Church has printed it. So if you want to get a copy, any of them will do, but if you look for a little bit later, it'll be even better. So after Robert Matthews studied it and got what he needed, the LDS Church for the first time included some of Joseph Smith's new translation in their version of the King James Bible. Okay, here are 2 books that Robert Matthews was involved in. So this is the one from the 70s, and it's, how do you put it? The most comprehensive and a very good one. This, and it's just, you can get it in paperback or hardcover. This one is this big, huge, fat hardcover book with all 400 something pages of the manuscript, like facsimiles of them, and like every single strike through, every single line ending, like they wanted everything preserved in that. And it has some good history too. Robert Matthews was one of the editors of that. So if you're interested, you can look those up. These are my two main sources for my paper and my talk today. This is the 1867 version of the inspired version. The RLDS Church did not call it the inspired version at first. It says, the Holy Scriptures translated and corrected by the Spirit of Revelation by Joseph Smith Jr., the Seer. And it wasn't until decades later that it started being called the inspired version. So the book on the right is the 1944 version, when it got called the inspired version. I think the 1936 edition was just inspired version, and then later they added the Holy Scriptures. So anyway, so when people talk about the inspired version, they're referring to the title that the RLDS Church gave it. That's not my favorite name for it for a few reasons. It's not Robert Matthews either. One of it is because Joseph Smith always called it the New Translation. His contemporaries called it the New Translation. The Doctrine and Covenants calls it the New Translation. So my favorite term for it is the New Translation, hence the title of my talk. Another reason I don't love the title inspired version is because semantically it's implying that other versions aren't inspired, which isn't true. So that's another reason. And I also don't like how nondescript it is. Like someone who doesn't know what that is, there's no restoration context to it at all. So I prefer Joseph Smith's New Translation. I think it says what it is accurately with the proper context. So that is what I will use, is Joseph Smith's New Translation. When Robert Matthews was helping make the 1979 edition of the LDS Bible, well, the King James Version of the Bible that the church prints, he wanted to use the phrase New Translation. But the acronym NT was already in use for the New Testament. So they had to kind of compromise on what they were going to call it. And that's where the phrase Joseph Smith translation came from, is from the preparation for that Bible. So JST is referring to the changes from Joseph Smith's New Translation that got put into the footnotes and appendix of the LDS Bible. So here is a slide kind of summarizing the different terms. So of course KJV is King James Version, IV is the inspired version of the Bible as published by the RLDS Church. I know they're the Community of Christ now, but when they did all the publishing, they weren't yet. So I'm just going to keep calling them RLDS for this talk at least. Joseph Smith translation, JST, and then JSNT. That's basically just my made up acronym. Okay, if you go looking on the interwebs for talk using that acronym, you won't find it. Now the people who work on it, like the people who did this book, they refer to it as a New Translation. And in their department at BYU, they do. So I'm not the only one using that, but the JSNT, I think that could be a reasonable acronym to use for it. That includes the word new. So now here's one of the things, one of the reasons I got interested in looking deeper into the Joseph Smith translation is because when I was in seminary, I had my little red quad that my mom took me to Deseret Book and bought for me. And I went through the whole Bible and I marked all the JST footnotes, not only at the bottom of the page, but also up in the verse where the little mark is, because I didn't want to miss anything. Like I wanted it all. And it wasn't till much, much later that I learned that the LDS edition doesn't have all of the changes Joseph Smith made. That was like a big shock to me to find out that they're not all in there. So that's another reason I would like to distinguish between JST and JSNT, because to me, the JST is what the changes which were included in the LDS scriptures, and the JSNT is going to be all the changes. So, all right, so the Joseph Smith change, and it's a big difference in numbers at least. So Joseph Smith changed over 3,000 verses, but only 600 of them are in the LDS scriptures. So if you want all of them, you have to go somewhere else. Now, I would love it if they would include more of them, because I love the way they print it and stuff, you know, the thin paper and the leather binding and all the appendixes. And I love all that. So I wish, I hope someday they'll add even more now that they have access to all of it. So, but one of the places you can find it. So let's talk about now where you can read it. So in the LDS canon, short, tiny excerpts are at the bottom in the footnotes. And then there's also this appendix at the back after the Bible dictionary that says Joseph Smith translation excerpts too lengthy for inclusion in footnotes. So that's where you can find some of the bigger chunks. And then, of course, the large pieces that we've had in our scriptures for a long time are in the Pearl of Great Price. So the Book of Moses and Joseph Smith Matthew, those are both from the Joseph Smith New Translation. So one of the things that was also news to me, I thought the Book of Moses was basically the beginning of Genesis, and it is, but the first chapter of Moses isn't considered part of Genesis. It's considered a preface to Genesis. So in the inspired version, it's its own thing at the beginning. It's just labeled like a revelation or something like that. And so technically Moses 1 isn't supposed to be Genesis 1, Moses 2 is Genesis 1. Anyway, so this is where you can find it in the LDS scriptures, Pearl of Great Price, the footnotes, and the appendix. So if you want, so you have to go outside the LDS scriptures for the remainder of the changes. The inspired version is great if you want to use that. So it has all the changes, including the removal of the Book of Song of Solomon, which Joseph Smith said was revealed to him that it is not inspired writing. So the inspired version doesn't even have the Song of Solomon. And reading the IV, I think, is a good option if you just want to read the Bible in its purity. But one thing is, in your studies, it doesn't show you what was changed. It just has the text. So if you want to see what was changed, you can find books that have side-by-side comparisons. So it has the King James on one side and then the inspired version on the other side, and that's a good way to do it. But my favorite way to do it is this book, which was integrated by Kenneth and Lyndall Lutz. It's called The Bible Corrected by Joseph Smith, and rather than a side-by-side comparison, as you can find in other sources, this book shows the corrections made by Joseph Smith by putting the deletions in a strike-through font, so you can still read it, but you can tell that he deleted it, and then it puts the insertions in a bold font, and then everything that's the same is just in a regular font. So you can literally either read the regular font plus the strike-through to read the King James, or you can read the regular font plus the bold and ignore the strike-through to read the Joseph Smith New Translation, and I think that's a wonderful way to do it. This book is also cool because I was telling you that the sermons of Joseph Smith, sometimes he would mention this word or this phrase should have been translated a different way. This book puts some of those in, which is cool. And it puts in the footnote when they do that. And it tells you like what sermon, what page on Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith or whatever they took that from. So I think that's cool too. This was my favorite one. Yep. And you can get it. I would say this one. Yes. Yes. It partly depends on if you're interested in the history and all the details about who was helping on the project, then you want to get one of Robert Matthew's books. But if you just want the text of the Joseph Smith New Translation, this is the one to get. And they have it in hardcover and paperback. Yeah, you have a question? Okay, no, I'm sorry, the man behind you.
I can't see the full name of it.
The Bible Corrected by Joseph Smith. That's the Bible Corrected by Joseph Smith, yeah. Yeah, and if you have I didn't bring it up, the blue conference book, all this stuff is in there too, so, thank you. So while this book contains all of Joseph Smith's New Translation, it doesn't include all of the uncorrected Bible. So you still have to use it side by side with your regular King James Bible. It does have, you know what I'm saying? So like if there's a chapter or verse that's not corrected, it won't be in there. So you have to, if you want to just read the Bible, you have to put it side by side. It does have all of Genesis, which is convenient because there's a lot of changes in Genesis, and it has all the Gospels. There's also a lot of changes in the Gospels. So I thought that was nice of them to do it. So, okay, and then another option to study it is to read it online. This is a screenshot of the website I like to use to read it online. It's centerplace.org. This is again in my paper in the book. This is a website for one of the restoration breakoffs of the LDS Church. It has the full text of the inspired version and a side-by-side comparison. So you can see it has Genesis, I actually can't tell, chapter 8, I think. So one of the things I would like to ask Joseph Smith about this, because I don't really love the different chapters and the different verses. It's very confusing when you want to compare versions of the Bible. So I wonder how important it is to the new translation to use the new verses and the new chapters. So you'll find that is a bit of a hang up sometimes when you're studying, but you can get over it. So the inspired version, chapter 8, or the King James Version, chapter 6. And so here are two verses. When they're side by side, it's because it's the same verse. And when there's all this extra text over here and blank over here, it's because information was inserted by Joseph Smith. And so this is a good way to do it side by side. I like to use this website if I want to be able to copy and paste it, like for my PowerPoint, that sort of thing, or if I want to be able to have it on my phone. I haven't found like a super good app or something, so somebody ought to write one. But to just be able to see the text and side by side, you can go to this website. I find that useful. Okay, I'm going to go into some examples, but I actually would like to pause for just a second and see if there's anything I confuse people about or any questions. Are you good? Should we get into some examples? Okay, let's do it.
In your experience going on this,
Yes.
the 600 changes that the church has incorporated in the JST versus the JSMT,
Yeah.
like, how many of those do you feel are really like, I can imagine some of them might be more, like, how many of them are real things?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the question was the 600 verses in the JST compared to the 3,400 in the JSNT, the number of verses that were changed. How many of those are substantial? How many are not? So I think it's a fair question. I think there are plenty of examples that are meaningful, and to me, and I'm going to go over some of them today. But plenty of them are just like grammatical, you know, they changed words here and there, punctuation that may or may not change the meaning of the verse. I don't know if anybody's compared them that closely. So actually I'm working on this book, since it shows all the changes Joseph Smith made. I've been going through it with a red pencil and marking which of the changes are not in the LDS, not in the JST. Because I want to be able to open that book and all the red is stuff that you're not going to get in the LDS scriptures. And there's some really interesting things. And sometimes it's like, why didn't they put that in? That would have been so good. Like in the Sermon on the Mount, there are entire verses in the Sermon on the Mount that aren't included. And I don't know how they chose. I honestly don't know how they chose. So, but I'm sure not all 2,800 are equally meaningful. So yeah, you should look into it yourself and see. I think so. But yeah. Okay. So here's one of my favorite examples of a change made in the Joseph Smith New Translation. This example is in the JST. So it's the story of Noah and the ark and the promise of the rainbow. So this is a picture from the book published by the LDS Church called Old Testament Stories. It's like the comic book version of the scriptures. They have one for each of the standard works. So this is the picture. So it says, Noah thanked God for saving their lives. He built an altar. He burned sacrifices. God promised Noah he would never again send a flood to cover the earth. God put a rainbow in the sky. The rainbow helps people remember God's promise to Noah. So this is a very common story to include in children's versions of the Bible, like storybooks. And it usually includes the promise of the rainbow. We all know the promise of the rainbow is that God will never flood the earth again the way he did. Although, to be honest, that's not that reassuring to me because God has other ways he can destroy people when he wants to. So, okay, he'll never flood the earth. He knows how to use fire and all kinds of things. So I was so thrilled when I learned that actually there's more to the promise of the rainbow than is in the children's versions and in the King James Version. So this one, if you want to find it for yourself, it is in the appendix. Did I say that already? It's in the appendix at the back of the LDS scriptures. Okay, so I have like 5 scanned in images from just the Bible storybooks I have at my house that have this. So I'm going to kind of show them up there while I'm reading to you Joseph Smith's changes so that you don't get too bored with this kind of long passage I'm going to read to you. Okay. Oh, oops, I didn't read these ones. Okay. And God spake unto Noah and to his sons with him, saying, And I, behold, I will establish my covenant with you, which I made unto your father Enoch, concerning your seed after you. And it shall come to pass that every living creature that is with you, of the fowl and of the cattle and of the beast of the earth that is with you, which shall go out of the ark, shall not altogether perish. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood. Neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you, which I made unto Enoch, concerning the remnants of your posterity. And God made a covenant with Noah and said, This shall be the token of the covenant I make between me and you, and for every living creature with you, for perpetual generations. I will set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which I have made between me and you, for every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant which I made unto thy father Enoch, that when men should keep all my commandments, Zion should again come on the earth, the city of Enoch, which I have caught up on unto myself. And this is mine everlasting covenant, that when thy posterity shall embrace the truth and look upward, then shall Zion look downward, and all the heavens shall shake with gladness, and the earth shall tremble with joy. And the general assembly of the church of the firstborn shall come down out of heaven and possess the earth, and shall have place until the end come. And this is mine everlasting covenant, which I made with thy father Enoch. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will establish my covenant unto thee, which I have made between me and thee, for every living creature of all flesh that shall be upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, This is the token of the covenant, which I have established between me and thee for all flesh that shall be upon the earth. Did you catch it? So in the book of Moses, God makes this promise to Enoch, and you can read that. So that's the covenant being referred to there. But it's not just that God won't flood the earth again. The rainbow is supposed to remind us of Zion and the fact that someday Zion will come again when we're ready, when we keep all the commandments. So the fact that the rainbow looks like a bridge between heaven and earth, that's not a coincidence. That's by design. I love that. All right. Definitely inspires me to try to make my home and family as close to Zion as I can. Okay, let's look at another example. Here's another one that is in the JST. So this is Abraham paying tithing. Let's see. I don't think it's in the footnote. It's in the appendix. It's in the appendix, yeah. So the verse says, Abram paid unto Melchizedek tithes of all that he had, of all the riches which he possessed, which God had given him, more than that which he had need. Then that's one of the changes made, is that he paid tithing not on 100% of what he had, but of what he had, what God had given him more than that which he had need. So when you come across the tithing question, this is a useful verse to help you figure it out. Okay, let's talk about another one. Now this is a picture of my two oldest children that are here today. So that's 2-year-old Zoe holding her little baby brother. And can you believe, just cannot believe that people think they are wicked, or they have, what is it called, original sin, that they are gonna go to hell if they don't get baptized right away. I just can't wrap my mind around that. And I'm so grateful to be a part of a religion that teaches otherwise. So there's several places that teach otherwise. And one of them is in the JSNT. This was probably the earliest one, actually. what's the other one? Well, no, the one in Moses is probably the earliest. So the one in Moses, which is Genesis, I don't know what the chapter and verse is in Genesis because they're all different, it's confusing, but it says, the Lord said unto Adam, behold, I have forgiven thee thy transgression in the Garden of Eden. Hence came the saying abroad among the people that the Son of God hath atoned for original guilt, wherein the sins of the parents cannot be answered upon the heads of the children, for they are whole from the foundation of the world. Isn't that nice? And then, of course, the Book of Mormon, I mean, it doesn't mince words at all. It teaches very clearly that if you're even, what does it say? If you're even in the thought that a child needs baptism when you die, that you'll be cut off or something very dramatic. And the Doctrine and Covenants gives the age of accountability too, but before that section was received was the Joseph Smith New Translation of Genesis 17. And it gives Abraham the actual age of accountability. It's actually in the JSNT of the Bible. So it says, hold on, let me see if I have I didn't do it. I will establish a covenant of circumcision with thee, and it shall be my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee in their generations, that thou mayest know forever that children are not accountable before me until they are 8 years old. So it seems like the commandment to be circumcised at 8 days old is partly to help us understand that children aren't accountable until they are 8 years old. Okay, so I think that's very interesting and very nice. And then the Doctrine and Covenants, of course, makes it explicit that children ought to get baptized when they're 8 years old. Okay, couple other things I didn't make slides for, but this is in the JST. There's a couple stories in the book of Genesis about Lot and his daughters that are kind of confusing. So the first time I read it, I don't know, maybe every time I read it until I noticed the JST, I was pretty confused by it. So the King James Version says that Lot offered his daughters to the wicked men outside his door, but the JST changes it to saying that Lot actually, like, they demanded his daughters and he refused their demands. So that's nice. And then the other one about Lot and his daughters is when they got him drunk and slept with him. And in the King James Version, it doesn't like tell you whether that was good or bad. It just has this story. But the JST says that they dealt wickedly in doing that. So that's some clarification. Then one other I'll mention is in the creation story in Genesis, and I can't tell you why this is meaningful, but I think it must be. The creation story, the word heavens becomes heaven. So that might be worth looking into. Okay, let's get into some examples that are not in the JST, that are in the JSNT. So one of them, and I'll start with like kind of a, I don't know, lighthearted one a little bit. So in Genesis chapter 24, there's this story about Abraham sending his eldest servant to get a wife for Isaac. And Rebekah draws water from the well for the servant and the camels, and that's the sign the servant was looking for. And so in verse 47, he, quote, put the earring upon her face and the bracelets upon her hands. And the LDS edition of the King James of that verse has this interesting footnote on the word earring. It says, that word actually translates better in Hebrew to mean nose ring. So they used up this footnote space to clarify the word earring to say nose ring. And other people have noticed this too, besides people that use the LDS edition. So here's this little comic I found online. My master Abraham wanted me to give you this nose ring and bracelets. And she's like, not sure what to think about that. And then here's another one. This is on somebody's Instagram. The first written record of nostril piercing dates back to the Middle East 4,000 years ago. Nostril piercing is also referenced in the biblical book of Genesis, where Abraham's son Isaac gives his future wife Rebekah a golden shamph, which is Hebrew for nose ring. So that's interesting. I have used this verse and the footnote in good humor to tease my judgmental peers who considered nose rings to be rebellious. But in all truthfulness, this is actually an example of a Joseph Smith change that's not included in the Bible because the JSNT actually says, "And I gave the earrings unto her to put into her ears, and the bracelets upon her hands." So perhaps the same amount of footnote space could have clarified it in a different way. But anyway, the point is that this particular verse can't actually be used to make the point that Mother Rebecca had a nose ring. So anyway, I thought about, because I knew I was going to be talking about this when I was choosing a photograph to be on the website. I was like, should I like Photoshop a nose ring onto it? That'd be funny, right? And Josh was like, okay. All right, so let's go on to another example. So Genesis chapter 15, this has an interaction between Abram and the Lord. The Lord promises Abram's seed in number as the stars, as well as a land to inherit. And in the King James Version, Abram asks the Lord, "Whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it?" And it might come across a little bit as like prove it. Like I'm a little bit skeptical, but the Joseph Smith New Translation adds a little clause and it says, "Yet he believed God." And I just think that's nice. Little evidence of Abram's faithfulness to the Lord. And then in Genesis 21, there's a little bit that makes, I think, Sarah look pretty nice too, as far as being faithful. So let's look at it. This is what kind of the side-by-side looks like when you study it. I've broken it down more than just by the verse, but the King James Version, it says, "And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him. And Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. And she said, Who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age." And it's not, it doesn't, the inspired version here, it doesn't really change the story the way adding the word not might or something, but I just think it's nice. It says, "And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him. And Sarah said, God has made me to rejoice, and also all that know me will rejoice with me." Because the people that know her, of course, will know she was barren. So you don't have to hear her laugh. You can just know her and know that she's finally got a son, and you can rejoice with her. "And she said unto Abraham, Who would have said that Sarah should have given children suck? For I was barren, but the Lord promised, and I have borne unto Abraham a son in his old age." And I just love that line. I was barren, but the Lord promised. And of course, the Old Testament is just full of examples of God keeping his promises. And here Sarah acknowledges it. Here's a picture of the new parents. So here's another little change, and it doesn't dramatically alter the story, but it is a little interesting. The King James Version of Genesis 17:16 says Sarah is a mother of nations, but the JSNT changes it to the mother of nations. Okay, let's talk about Abraham and Isaac and the binding a little bit. So God tried Abraham. Okay, no, I'm sorry. Genesis 22:1 says God did tempt Abraham, but the JSNT changes it to God did try Abraham. So that might be meaningful to someone. And then I picked this picture showing Isaac carrying the wood up the mountain. That's what the King James Version says, but the JSNT, not the JST, says that actually Abraham was the one that carried the wood up. Did I just say Abraham? I meant Isaac. Yeah, so Abraham, the JSNT indicates that it was the old man that carried the wood up the mountain and not his strong young son, Isaac. And then a final example in the story of the binding is, you might notice when you're reading it, the King James Version, Isaac is referred to by the Lord or by the angel as Abraham's only son. But Joseph changes it in multiple instances to thine only Isaac. So that's interesting, especially considering he did have other sons. Although I've heard people draw meaning from the fact that Isaac was called only son. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into the meaning or lack of meaning to these things. I just want to kind of highlight some of them. There are lots of other examples that you'll have to study the JSNT for yourself. Here are a few. And some of these you're probably familiar with from the Book of Moses, because that's been in the LDS canon for a long time. The spiritual creation happened before the natural one. I'm not going to give this one away. You'll have to find this one, but the JSN tells you the primary purpose of trees. It might surprise you. Another example, Adam may choose for himself whether to eat the fruit. You know that line? Nevertheless, thou mayest choose for thyself, but know that in the day you eat, you shall surely die. That is unique to the LDS, and it's in the JSNT. It's actually in the JST as well, but that's not something, and that's not something everybody with the Bible has. The nature of Satan, the secret oath he taught to Cain, Adam's baptism, what animal sacrifices symbolize, and the gospel being taught to Adam's posterity. Those are all many more examples just in the book of Genesis. There's a footnote in my paper that says I had to show extreme self-restraint not to delve into the New Testament at all, because there's some really good stuff there. So maybe, yeah, there's just good stuff there too. Okay, more work to be done on the JSNT. I mentioned, what did I say someone ought to do? Make an app. Yeah, exactly. A JSNT app would be awesome. I actually didn't put that in my slide here, but there is more work to be done. If you're interested, I think it would be great if the JST had more of the JSNT changes. They're pretty satisfied with it, so I don't see that really happening. I just think it would be cool. I think an audiobook would be great. As far as I know, there isn't one. If I'm wrong, let me know, because I would love to have an audiobook of the all the changes. I mentioned, so number 3, I mentioned my own personal project to go through all the changes and mark which ones are not in the JST. And the purpose of that for me is because if you had a copy of the JSNT without the JST, it would just be the perfect supplement to the LDS scriptures you're already using. So there wouldn't be overlap, there wouldn't be redundancy. It would just be like, take what you already have and here's what to add. And I think that would be nice. I'm kind of making my own copy, but if someone wanted to actually turn it into a book that was available, that'd be really cool. I think it'd be great if there was a children's illustrated book with the story of Noah with the full promise of what the rainbow means with Zion, maybe even connect it to the Enoch promise as well. And then I showed you the picture of the binding with Isaac carrying the wood. Does someone want to draw it with Abraham carrying the wood? I don't know. That could be another idea to add resources and embrace it. I think it's important as Latter-day Saints for us to embrace all of the things Joseph Smith restored. And so this is just my small way to do that. And that's the end of my presentation. So let's take questions.
Questions,
Did you check the Zoom? That's okay, I can do that. I'm nervous about the questions. I don't know if I'll be able to answer them. I'm just interested, I'm not an expert, you know. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to first take a question on the Zoom chat. This is from Bradley Kramer, who's going to be speaking later. He said, well, actually, I'll take Jeff Foley's question real quick. 1830 to 1833. Yes, 1830 to 1833 is when the new translation happened. Summertime to summertime, about 3 years. And then this other question says, I think of the JSNT as notes from Joseph Smith's scripture study sessions with the Lord, that it was not complete, that it was not meant to be published, that many books of the Bible were not changed in the least. Does your research support, refute, or modify this opinion? So some of the books did not have any changes. That is true. It was meant to be published. And in fact, I was going to mention this before, Joseph Smith collected money to try to fund the publishing of it. And he did work on modifying it with mostly Sidney Rigdon helped him to change the manuscripts to be more prepared to be printed. So I believe it was meant to be published. And as far as it being complete, I think I did talk about that. He said that he wrote in a letter to someone, this day I finished the translation of the scriptures. He used the word finished, and then he never went back and tackled it the same way. Although I did mention that sometimes he was like, well, this word could have been translated better. So maybe it's something that you can, like, you'll never be done with. Okay. Are you aware of any historical information that indicates whether Joseph Smith used the Urim and Thummim or a seer stone when working on his new translation of the Bible? That is a great question. He did not use the Urim and Thummim. At least there's no evidence of it. I believe somebody like 50 years later mentioned that he had, but the scholars don't think he did. There's no actual contemporary evidence that he did use it. So it was just him and God. And I don't know, and I don't think the seer stone either. Did what Moroni said match the Bible after Joseph Smith translated it? I'm not sure I understand that question. Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, we should definitely look at that. So that's in Joseph Smith history. Somebody could just look it up right now and see it, like quotes Malachi, and then does it give a full enough quote? I can't answer that question, but that's a good question. That'd be interesting to see. I've thought about comparing. I haven't done this yet, but I think it would be interesting to compare the Joseph Smith new translation to the similar passages in the Book of Mormon too. I think that'd be an interesting study. But yeah, good question. I wish I could answer it, but we'll go on to the next one. I've heard that Abraham thought that Isaac was going to be the sacrifice for the world's sin. That's interesting. I don't know if that's what Abraham thought. I think there's definitely some symbolism. I think Isaac and Abraham is definitely a type of the true sacrifice. And actually, my family's gone to hear me as I've gone through the process of preparing this. I shared that the JSNT says, oh, do something. The JSNT says that Abraham actually was the one that carried the wood up the mountain. That's actually not my favorite change in the JSNT, because I liked it better when Isaac carried the wood because of the symbolism of Jesus carrying his own cross. So anyway. What is your favorite verse that is only in the JSNT? It depends on what mood I'm in. It's probably the nose ring one. If I'm in a goofy mood. And then if I'm kind of more serious, it's probably one of the verses from the Sermon on the Mount that were changed. That's a good question. How does the Book of Mormon version of the Sermon on the Mount compare to the JSNT? I was just mentioning that. That would be worth a study. I don't know. You guys probably don't necessarily want to hear my opinion, but since I'm asked, I personally think that the Book of Mormon, it was such hard work for Joseph Smith to translate the Book of Mormon, so difficult. And I don't blame him one bit for possibly taking shortcuts to make it go a little quicker. And I wonder sometimes, I'm not saying this is true or even that I necessarily believe it, but I wonder sometimes if when Joseph Smith got to those parts in the Book of Mormon that were very similar to what was happening in the Bible, if instead of coming up with a pure Book of Mormon translation, if he couldn't help but default to those passages in the Bible he probably had memorized, such as the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon at Bountiful. And one of the reasons I wonder about that is because the King James Version or the Book of Mormon version is closer to the King James Version of the Sermon on the Mount than it is to the JSNT. And that's worth looking at. Those verses, those entire verses that are added to the JSNT, they're not in the Book of Mormon. Anyway, but I hope that doesn't take away from any of my testimony. It doesn't, for me, take away any of my testimony of Joseph Smith or anything. He's just a man, and anyone who's received revelation of any kind knows how, when it's filtered through a flawed person, it's got to be viewed that way. So anyway, I hope that answered that question. Are there any more questions? No? Okay, thank you for your attention.
All right, well, that ends our second session. We'll take another break and meet back here at 10:45. You'll hear the sound of the shofar again. So